Hello, Social Studies class. Today we're back with part 2 of our reading for Japan's Pacific Campaign. So last time we really dug in with that map, so I think you have a better idea and a visual kind of like where the fighting was occurring in the Pacific with Japan and with the Allies. So Japan, especially at the beginning of the Pacific Campaign, was really successful, starting with their surprise attack of Pearl Harbor. Then they were able to really expand their empire across a lot of islands in the Pacific. What we're going to read about today is the Allies and how they were able to kind of turn the tide and start to weaken the Japanese and their empire and their navy and their air force in the Pacific. The Allies strike back. After a string of victories, the Japanese seemed unbeatable. Nonetheless, the Allies, mainly Americans and Australians, were anxious to strike back in the Pacific. The United States in particular wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor. In April of 1942, 16 B-25 bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle bombed Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. The bombs did little damage. The raid, however, made an important psychological point to both Americans and Japanese. Japan was vulnerable to attack. The Allies turned the tide. Doolittle's raid on Japan raised American morale and shook the confidence of some in Japan. As one Japanese citizen noted, "We started to doubt that we were invincible." In addition, some Japanese worried that defending and controlling a vast empire had caused them to spread their resources too thin. So we have our vocabulary word. Invincible means unconquerable, that they can't be beat. Slowly, the Allies began to turn the tide of war. Early in May of 1942, an American fleet with Australian support intercepted a Japanese strike force headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea, which is like a island nation off the coast of Australia. This city housed a critical Allied air base. Control of the air base would put the Japanese in easy striking distance of Australia. In the battle that followed, the Battle of the Coral Sea, both sides used a new kind of naval warfare. The opposing ships did not fire a single shot. In fact, they often could not see one another. Instead, airplanes taking off from huge aircraft carriers attacked the ships. The Allies suffered more losses in ships and troops than did the Japanese. However, the Battle of the Coral Sea was something of a victory, for the Allies had stopped Japan's southward advance. The Battle of Midway. Japan next targeted Midway Island, some 1,500 miles west of Hawaii, the location of a key American airfield. Thanks to Allied codebreakers, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew that a huge Japanese force was heading toward Midway. Admiral Yamamoto himself was in command of the Japanese fleet. He hoped that the attack on Midway would draw the whole of the U.S. Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor to defend the island. So let's look at this question here. Analyzing motives. Motive is like why a group of people would want to do something. So the question is, why might the Americans send their entire Pacific Fleet to defend Midway Island? So really, I think the reason for that was probably that after Pearl Harbor, they wanted to make sure that their aircraft carriers and their ships and planes that they defended on in the Pacific theater really were able to continue to be operational so they can continue their campaign against the Japanese. So had they lost Midway Island or suffered devastating losses like they did in Pearl Harbor at Midway, it would have been really tough for them the rest of the war. On June 4th, with American forces hidden beyond the horizon, Nimitz allowed the Japanese to begin their assault on the island. As the first Japanese planes got into the air, American planes swooped in to attack the Japanese fleet. Many Japanese planes were still on the decks of the aircraft carriers. The strategy was a success. American pilots destroyed 332 Japanese planes, all 4 aircraft carriers and 1 support ship. Yamamoto ordered his crippled fleet to withdraw. By June 7th of 1942, the battle was over. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of war in the Pacific. We're going to head over here and look at, it's called History Makers, and this is a picture of General Douglas MacArthur, who is an American general. Douglas MacArthur's qualities as a leader and a fighting soldier emerged in France during World War I. Showing incredible dash and courage on the battlefield, he received several decorations for bravery, and he won promotion from the rank of major to brigadier general. After serving in several positions in the United States, MacArthur received a posting to the Philippines in 1935. He remained there until shortly before the islands fell in 1941. But he left very reluctantly. In a message to the troops who remained behind, he vowed, "I shall return." As you will read later in this chapter, MacArthur kept his promise. An Allied offensive. With morale high after their victory at Midway, the Allies took the offensive. The war in the Pacific involved vast distances. Japanese troops had dug in on hundreds of islands across the ocean. General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the Allied land forces in the Pacific, developed a plan to handle this problem. MacArthur believed that storming each island would be a long, costly effort. Instead, he wanted to island hop past Japanese strongholds. He would then seize islands that were not well defended but were closer to Japan. So the main idea here is identifying problems. If the vast distances of the Pacific caused problems for the Allies, how might they have caused problems for the Japanese also? So that makes sense. If it's hard to conquer islands that are far apart, it's also hard to defend a lot of different islands that are not easily connected and separated by vast distances also. So that was a challenge for both the Allies and for the Japanese. MacArthur's first target soon presented itself. U.S. military leaders had learned that the Japanese were building a huge airbase on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Allies had to strike fast before the base was completed and became another Japanese stronghold. At dawn on August 7, 1942, several thousand U.S. Marines, with Australian support, landed on Guadalcanal and the neighboring island of Tulagi. The Marines had little trouble seizing Guadalcanal's airfield, but the battle for control of the island turned into a savage struggle as both sides poured in fresh troops. In February of 1943, after 6 months of fighting, on land and at sea, the Battle of Guadalcanal finally ended. After losing more than 24,000 of a force of 36,000, the Japanese abandoned what they came to call the Island of Death. To American war correspondent Ralph Martin and the U.S. soldiers who fought there, Guadalcanal was simply hell. So we're going to read a primary source by this Ralph Martin. He was an American war correspondent, so think of him as like a reporter. He's like a civilian, and he's covering the war. So he's like writing about it, and he's like informing the American public of things that are going on in the war. He's not necessarily like a soldier himself. So this is a primary source, meaning like this is what he's writing at the time that the history was created. Hell was red furry spiders as big as your fist, enormous rats and bats everywhere, and rivers with wading crocodiles. Hell was the sour, foul smell of the squishy jungle, humidity that rotted a body within hours. Hell was an enemy, so fanatic that it used its own dead as booby traps. As Japan worked to establish a new order in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Nazis moved ahead with Hitler's design for a new order in Europe. This design included plans for dealing with those Hitler considered unfit for the Third Reich. You'll learn about these plans in Section 3, which we'll cover next week, guys. All right, let's take a look at this picture here as we wrap up. So here is a primary source. That's an image of U.S. Marines storming ashore at Guadalcanal. So Guadalcanal is an island, and these Marines stormed the beaches, basically, and were successful at the Battle of Guadalcanal.